Hello, I'm Infamous and it's time for Queer Drama. Now, I'm not really a person of the world, but I do my best to touch upon as great a range of human experience as possible. So far, I've dealt with unrequited love, weird psychotic love, realisation of sexuality, repression and sexual abuse. And now it's time for me to turn my attention to something equally heavy. It's time to talk about loss. The grieving process is quite painful for us to witness, and usually in film it's restricted to a big no after an on-screen death, some sad violin music, and then the story moves on. Put simply, it's an emotion too uncomfortable for most directors to base an entire film around. But there are always exceptions, and there are always directors who are willing to try something different. So let's watch a film where Colin Firth plays an LGBT character who...
How dull it seems!
Are you the hero of my dream?
No, not that. Let's watch a film where Colin Firth plays an LGBT character who wants to commit suicide because of... No, we've already done that one. Everyone, light up that lucky strike and turn on the slow-mo. This is A Single Man.
Do I like being single? Am I coming back? Am I coming back?
Ah yes, A Single Man. First a book written by gay author Christopher Isherwood in the early 1960s, it was adapted to film in 2009 by Tom Ford. The name Tom Ford may be familiar to the more fashion-conscious among you, because the man is a fashion designer and he's best known for this sort of thing. Classy. Now usually one doesn't have a great deal of confidence in films directed by those whose primary talent lies elsewhere of the field of film direction, particularly when you consider the fact that many consider fashion designers to be the deeply superficial creators of redundant, highly expensive clothing that has absolutely nothing to do with the life of an average person. So how could a fashion designer create a film that was more than just style over substance? How could Tom Ford, a fashion designer, make a film that might possibly resonate with people as opposed to something similarly silly to Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette? Well, let's reserve judgment and begin. George Falconer is an English professor in California whose partner of 16 years, Jim, was killed in a car accident over a year ago. Not allowed to attend Jim's funeral, or even to acknowledge publicly that the two had a long-term relationship, George internalises his grief to the extent that he can no longer go on.
Looking in the mirror, staring back at me, isn't so much a face as the expression of a predicament.
Just get through the goddamn day.
Waking up on the 30th of November 1962, George decides that this is the day that he will kill himself.
Bit melodramatic, I guess. Then again, my heart has been broken.
He lays out his personal effects, writes letters and instructions to those close to him, and goes about his day for the last time, his interactions with people tinged with a particular kind of poignancy, because he knows that this will be the last time he will ever see them. The story is simple enough, and in the end is far more about the way the characters interact, and the feelings portrayed, rather than any particular events. So let's take a look at those characters. George Falconer is a white middle-class man who lives in a modernist house and has all the trappings of bourgeois success. However, he knows that he doesn't completely fit into the suburban lifestyle of the era, and he needs to be very guarded about his private life and feelings. Unlike Far From Heaven, the film does not dwell on George coming to terms with his sexuality or struggling against it. The film is not about George fighting his own internal repression, but is about the loss of a loved one, made ever more painful by the fact that, unlike those around him who lose someone they love, George has to hide his completely understandable feelings.
The service is just for family.
For family, of course. Well, thank you for calling.
Much of what makes this film worthwhile is Firth's performance. Put simply, this is the most effective portrayal of grief I have ever seen in a film. First, a little about myself. I'm a very contrary person, and if a film tries too hard to make me laugh, to make me think something is romantic, and most of all, to make me cry, then you'd better believe that the minute the weepy music starts, my face will assume a position similar to this. I find the idea of obvious emotional manipulation patronising, and many tearjerkers are so over the top in their attempts to be heart-wrenching that while viewing them I am transformed into a hard-faced, embittered cynic. But here, grief is handled very subtly and very poignantly. Every tiny emotion, every attempt at holding in that grief is reflected in George's face. It's a very human performance. We don't need music to make us feel George's deep despair when the emotion is so palpable through the performance alone.
I'm finished now, thank you.
George's pain, deep and carefully controlled, is contrasted by the emotional reactions of Charlie, his friend and long-term confidant. Divorced from her husband and now an empty nester, Charlie is similarly alone and feeling abandoned by her family. Unlike George, however, she displays her emotions very outwardly and does not persist in maintaining the appearance of normality in her life. She does not hold to a routine, she does not try and hold it together for others, but is instead her pure emotional unfettered self, drinking to excess and using George as an emotional crutch to deflect her own insecurities. We have to ask ourselves, is it better to be outwardly emotional like Charlie, or to hold it together for the sake of others like George does?
I don't like feeling sorry for myself one bit. I tried to hold on to Richard for so long, even it was obvious to everyone but me that it was over. And now Clay has grown up. I mean, what am I doing here, Joe? Tell me, what?
You have plenty of friends, you'll be fine.
Yes, I have friends, but none of them need me. And yes, I have you. And if you weren't such a goddamn puff, we could have all been happy.
He doesn't confide in her and tell her that he can no longer handle the grief and would rather be dead. Charlie pours out her emotions to George, and the only time he reacts angrily to her somewhat melodramatic behaviour is when she says that his relationship with Jim was somehow not real.
Don't you ever miss this? What we could have been to each other. Having a real relationship and kids.
I had Jim.
No, I mean a real relationship. Joe, let's be honest. What you and Jim had together was wonderful, but wasn't it really just a substitute for something else?
If the relationship with Jim wasn't real, then that means that the emotions that George is feeling are similarly not real. And Charlie's emotions are, by extension, more real and more worthy of attention than George's. No wonder he gets upset at her.
Jim and I were together for 16 years, and if he hadn't died, we'd still be together. The hell is not real about that?
There's a contrast between Charlie whimpering and feeling sorry for herself, and George deciding to actually do something about it. It's just that the decision to do something about it means that he's going to kill himself. Is it better for George to make a fatalistic, self-destructive decision than for him to remain stagnant and unable to move forward? What makes George different to Charlie is his capacity for acceptance. Charlie refuses to accept responsibility for how her life turned out.
I only have you now because you lost Jim. See, now I lose you to someone else. It's not as easy for a woman. I've done everything the way I was supposed to, and all I have to keep me company is a bottle of gin.
She can't accept that George will never be attracted to her through no fault of his own. She can't accept that her son has moved out and her husband has left her. George initially struggles with accepting Jim's death, but in the end he's able to overcome the anguish that he struggles through each day. He's not like Charlie at all. Indeed, if Charlie wants to heap her emotions upon others, George almost takes the opposite approach. His emotional repression is, in a sense, done in order to make the lives of others easier, a little nicer. As he goes about what he decides will be his last day on earth, he's committed to being kind to people, complimenting them, helping them, and trying his utmost to be truthful and genuine towards them.
Sir, on page 79, Mr. Proctor says that the stupidest text in the Bible is "they hated me without a cause." Does that mean the Nazis were right to hate the Jews? Is Huxley an anti-Semite?
No, Mr. Huxley is not an anti-Semite. Of course, the Nazis were wrong to hate the Jews, but their hating the Jews was not without a cause. It's just that the cause wasn't real. The cause was imagined. The cause was fear. The minority is only thought of as one when it constitutes some kind of threat to the majority, a real threat or an imagined one. And therein lies the fear. That fear is why the minority is persecuted, and so you see there always is a cause. The cause is fear. Minorities are just people. People like us.
And it is this sudden desire for a kinder, more human reality, where he can be emotionally truthful towards others, that leads him to open up towards Kenny. Kenny reaches out to George first out of intrigue and sexual desire, clearly recognising that George himself has felt similar feelings. But he's not looking for emotional support like Charlie. Kenny is clearly sure of himself. He simply sees George as a kindred spirit.
Why don't you always talk to us like that?
I don't think it went over very well.
Man, the fear of things gets to me all the time. But you can't talk about it with anyone or you just sound like a fool.
At first, he simply wants a sexual connection to George, misinterpreting George's loneliness as a pure need for a sexual or romantic closeness. Later, he begins to realise that George is in danger and makes the unspoken decision to help him. George is clearly attracted to those who are younger and are less concerned with what society thinks of them and the need to conform and be a proper member of society. Kenny, as a student, is afforded a sort of freedom to experiment and to make up his own mind about the society he lives in.
May I ask you a personal question, sir?
If you like.
Do you ever get high?
Will he grow out of it later and become a conformist with an all-American family? Will he be like George, outwardly part of the system and inwardly rebelling? Or will he be like Jim, secure in himself and not caring about what others think? What interests George about Kenny is the possibilities that Kenny has. He can make any one of these decisions or decide something else entirely.
You know, everyone keeps telling you that when you're older, that you'll have all this experience. Like it's some great thing.
It's a load of shit. I think I've actually got sillier and sillier.
Really?
Absolutely.
So, all your experience is useless?
No, I wouldn't say that. In the words of our friend Mr. Huxley, experience is not what happens to a man, it's what a man does with what happens to him.
Finally, we have Jim. Presented entirely in the golden-tinted lens of George's recollections, Jim is, simply put, the perfect partner. The two obviously loved each other very much, and Jim's death is a shattering blow, and the whole catalyst for George's emotional journey.
What could be better than being tucked up here with you? I mean, if I died right now, it'd be okay.
Well, it wouldn't be okay with me. So why don't you shut up and go and change the record?
One would say that he's not much of a character, seeing as he's barely in the movie, but we're allowed to see what Jim was like, as opposed to simply hear George tell us.
Anyway, doesn't everyone sleep with women when they're young?
I have.
You're joking.
No, I'm not. It's just never anything that really interested me.
Well, you're awfully modern, aren't you? You know, I think that was the first thing I noticed about you. Was how sure of yourself you were.
Tom Ford is a man who knows the impact and power of visuals. There's a very strong colour theme running throughout the movie. George's world is greyish and bleak, and whenever things get a little brighter for him, or whenever he remembers a previous time when he was happy, the colour temperature changes, even within a single shot. All of the flashbacks are golden, like memories, but what's interesting is when he speaks to his next-door neighbour at the bank, the lighting grows warmer. Some of the visual style in the film is rather heavy-handed, such as the constant motif of drowning representing George's emotional state, but I think on the whole it works. Much like Far From Heaven, it's obviously a stylised depiction of reality and mood, but the performances of the actors elevate this above simply being the cinematic version of a fashion magazine. The movie may not have much in the way of plot, but at the same time it avoids the theatrical trap of having too much monologuing and having conversation replace visuals. We see George's character develop not merely from his flashbacks, but also the seemingly inconsequential encounters he has throughout the day.
You're really scaring me today, George.
Can't tell me I have an easy time with these students. I find them staring at me in a kind of bovine stupor, as if I were lecturing in a foreign language. Remind me why we shouldn't all just be annihilated?
You seem to think this is all a joke. We live in a world where nuclear war is a real threat. I don't understand how that doesn't concern you.
You're serious, aren't you?
Yes, I'm serious. George, did you even read the article I gave you on bomb shelters? Ours is almost done. We had 3 contractors work on it, so none of them know what we've got. And we're having the outside landscape, so no one will know that it's there.
Really?
If word gets out that you've got a better bomb shelter, then everyone will try to get in when something happens.
And so?
There'll be no time for sentiment when the Russians fire a missile at us.
Well, if it's going to be a world with no time for sentiment, Grant, then it's not a world I want to live in.
Every conversation is imbued with significance, as George believes that this will be the last time for him.
Your hair looks great like that. It really suits you. You always look so beautiful. Really fresh. And you have such a lovely smile. Really beautiful.
In the scene with the girl at the bank, Jennifer Strunk innocently repeats the views of her parents, her mother and her father, both of whom have clearly voiced negative opinions of George, but at the same time it's clear that these are opinions that she doesn't necessarily share or even understand.
Why do you look so sad? Would you like to meet Charlton Heston? He's our scorpion. Every night, we throw in something new to him and watch him kill it. Daddy says it's like a coliseum, so my brother Tom put all the columns on here. He wants to be a set designer. Daddy says he wants to throw you into the coliseum.
No kidding. Why?
Well, he says you're light in your loafers, but you're not even wearing any loafers.
She alone notices that George is sad, something that no one else has picked up on. Charlie is too absorbed in her own misery. George's work colleague is too concerned about the threat of impending nuclear annihilation. The only other person who is so transparently concerned about George's well-being and seems to notice how lonely he is the hustler that George meets in a parking lot.
I have to go.
Soy un buen tipo y creo que todo lo que necesitas es alguien que te quiera de verdad.
Thanks.
But what about Kenny? Well, Kenny, much like George, is hiding the way he feels. George hides his anguish and Kenny hides his concern. Instead of asking how George is really feeling, he instead tries his best to occupy George, to cheer him up with inconsequential distractions. When Kenny realises what George is intending to do, he remains light and flippant and doesn't try and talk about it, but he doesn't leave. Throughout the movie, there's the motif of time. Every scene is accompanied with a reminder that George's time is trickling away from him, until the end when it seems like everything is all right, and time is no longer important.
What time is it?
My watch seems to have stopped.
It's a very carefully styled film, and while some of the creative decisions are probably a little heavy-handed and might make the film a struggle for some, on the whole there are no glaringly bad decisions. In my mind, the stylistic decisions are half of what makes this film so beautiful to watch, and so different from many other character studies. For a first-time director, it's a very stylish and visually engaging film. A Single Man is lush with period detail, from the modernist house that George lives in to the contemporary fears of nuclear annihilation. Unsurprisingly, as the movie is directed by a fashion designer, the clothing is beautiful and stylistically distinctive. There's a few very nice touches, such as Don Bacardi, Christopher Isherwood's partner, appearing in one of the scenes.
Morning, Don.
Good morning, George.
And the voice on the phone at the beginning is that of John Hamm. His fame is entirely due to his starring role in Mad Men, which is set in the same time period.
It happened late yesterday, but his parents didn't want to call you.
I see.
In fact, they don't know that I'm calling you now, but I thought that you should know.
That said, the movie is riddled with little mistakes, mainly due to the set dressing. The moon was in a different phase on the 30th of November 1962. The whiskey that George was drinking didn't exist at the time, the particular recording of the opera aria was made several decades later, the connector and the phone handset only came in the 1970s, but all things considered, these details, while wrong, are relatively inconsequential. It's not as if the film hinges on a plot point involving a VHS tape or something equally obnoxious. So although I have a strong track record for being picky about these sorts of things, I'm going to give Tom Ford a pass for his handful of inconsequential errors, particularly considering that the film was shot in just 21 days. Although he did set the movie in the Cuban Missile Crisis, only to have it take place 1 month after the Cuban Missile Crisis had finished. Yeah, maybe you should have looked that one up, Tom. As I mentioned before, A Single Man was originally a book written by Christopher Isherwood, who's most famous for writing Cabaret. The basic structure of the adaptation is the same, the story takes place in one day and has the same plot. The interpretation and the intent is vastly different. It's not necessary to read the novel to understand the movie, but reading the novel helped me to understand just why the movie was so effective. In Isherwood's novel, George feels the loss of Jim, but rather than grief, he instead feels a misanthropic bitterness towards the world as a whole. He feels such alienation due to his otherness and his circumstances that he fantasises about systemically exterminating the moral crusaders, the senators and politicians, and the all-American family surrounding him. These people are not amusing. They should never be dealt with amusingly. They understand only one language, brute force. Therefore, we must launch a campaign of systemic terror. In order to be effective, this will require an organisation of at least 500 highly skilled killers and torturers, all dedicated individuals. The head of the organisation will draw up a list of clearly defined, simple objectives. They will then be dealt with in order, regardless of the time taken or the number of casualties. In each case, the principal criminal will first receive a polite note, signed Uncle George, explaining exactly what he must do before a certain deadline if he wants to stay alive. It will also be explained to him that Uncle George operates on the theory of guilt by association. 1 minute after the deadline, the killing will begin. The execution of the principal criminal will be delayed for some weeks or months to give him opportunity for reflection. Meanwhile, there will be daily reminders. His wife may be kidnapped, garroted, embalmed and seated in the living room to await his return from the office. His children's heads may arrive in cartons by mail, or tapes of the screams his relatives utter as they are tortured to death. His friends' homes may be blown up in the night. Anyone who has ever known him will be in mortal danger. When the organisation's 100% efficiency has been demonstrated a sufficient number of times, the population will slowly begin to learn that Uncle George's will must be obeyed instantly and without question. But does Uncle George want to be obeyed? Doesn't he prefer to be defied so he can just go on killing and killing, since all these people are just vermin and the more of them that die, the better? All are, in the last analysis, responsible for Jim's death. Their words, their thoughts, their whole way of life willed it, even though they never knew he existed. But when George gets in as deep as this, Jim hardly matters anymore. Jim is nothing now but an excuse for hating 3/4 of the population of America. God, I didn't know that I was reading a Bret Easton Ellis novel. You see a little bit of that potential psychopathy in the film, but it's dialed down to a much more acceptable level.
Christopher, would you like it if I killed you?
I don't know.
Well, if you keep this up, we're going to find out. So why don't you go home and stop shooting people?
Jim clearly meant something to George, but rather than grieving the loss of him, novel George seems more indifferent. The novel is far more about him regaining his sex drive rather than his will to live, because the suicide plot isn't even there at all. Yes, there's no indication in the book that George wants to kill himself, thus making the novel a very different sort of story. In the movie, George rediscovers the potential beauty of life through careful observation of the one day he thinks will be his last, and decides not to kill himself after all. The decision, while motivated by Kenny's presence, isn't so much about sex as it is about acceptance and moving on from his partner's death, while realising that life is worth living. Although sexuality is a key part of the story, George isn't entirely motivated by sexual desire, as one can see in his conversation with the hustler, and later, Kenny's very obvious unspoken offer of sexual companionship. On the other hand, George in the novel seems almost entirely motivated by sexual desire. He rediscovers his sex drive, has a wank, and then dies. Yes, really! Now, maybe masturbation and homicidal rage are perfectly logical reactions to the loss of a loved one, but I happen to prefer Ford and Firth's version. Perhaps Isherwood's version is more real, I wouldn't know, but it certainly doesn't make for a very good tale of self-discovery or acceptance of someone's death. Other thematic contributions to the story are Ford's own, including the scene with Jennifer in the bank, the encounter with the hustler, and even the phone call at the beginning. The emotional impact, the tone of the story as a study of grief, is all Tom Ford's contribution, and in my mind it's a real improvement on Isherwood's original text. In the book, George isn't the most likeable character. His motivations seem to be selfish and misanthropic, and while he's justifiably embittered, it's very difficult to sympathise with him. He's not identifiable enough for us to feel his pain, but he's not so charismatically misanthropic and horrible that he becomes compelling. He's hardly a Tom Ripley or a Patrick Bateman. He's just really hard to like. The emotional heart of the story in the film is all due to the creative input of the filmmakers. Tom Ford's directing and Colin Firth's performance transform the character of George to someone whose grief is extremely real to us. Maybe the interpretation is less sarcastic and more purely maudlin, but in my mind it's much more dramatically effective. As an aside, one of the most interesting and confusing things about this film is not how it differs from the novel or from history. Rather, it's a way that A Single Man was marketed, with a marketing strategy that could be best described as misleading and terrible. Maybe it's the fact that Tom Ford was an unproven first-time director, or maybe it's the thought that the film would have an overly narrow audience. Whatever the reasoning, the marketing and creative team decided to present the film in a very heterosexual light. There's absolutely nothing in the marketing material that hints at the LGBT themes of the movie, something that's crucial to the plot. The poster and the trailer played up the relationship with Julianne Moore, making the movie appear that it was about a heterosexual single man rediscovering romance or something, completely ignoring the fact that George's grief and feelings of alienation from society wouldn't be so pronounced if he'd had a female partner. Hell, the trailer for Victim is more homosexual than A Single Man's trailer. I mean, sure, it doesn't actually depict anything gay, but it certainly hints at it with the subtlety of a sledgehammer.
What crime links him with this frightened boy on a building site? And why is he afraid? Why do some people help him, some people turn away in disgust?
Why can't he stick with his own sort? You can come home Frank Jeffries when you've got rid of him.
And this movie came out in 1961. A whole year before A Single Man was even set. A Single Man's got no excuse. What exactly do they hope to gain from the misleading advertising? It's not as if this is a movie like Where the Truth Lies or American Beauty, where the homosexual content is a crucial third act plot development. Here, the theme is prevalent throughout the whole movie, and it isn't exactly ignored. Were they trying to trick homophobes into seeing the movie in the thought that it would somehow change their minds? The logical reasoning would be to do with the fact that Colin Firth and Julianne Moore were the biggest names in the film. But surely they could have at least put Matthew Good on the poster. After all, he was in Watchmen and Brideshead Revisited. He wasn't completely unknown. Plus, he was much more important to the plot than Julianne Moore, seeing as his presence was the catalyst for the way George was feeling, and the reason why George decided to make the choices he made. Ignoring his involvement misses the point entirely. Whatever the reasoning, the straightwashing of the marketing material seemed cringing and bizarre. So that was A Single Man. It's not a film for everyone, particularly those who are less impressed with visual or character-driven pieces, and some might find the slow pace and stylistic decisions maddening, but I describe it as a very impressive directorial debut from a man most well known for other unrelated creative pursuits. The film is well worth watching for Colin Firth's excellent performance alone. Firth is a genuinely fantastic actor with a good deal of range, skill, and a marvellous command of subtle emotions. And now, if you'll excuse me, I've got to go. I've got myself the dress. I think it's time that I got the scorpion to match.